school that's like moving us into a higher socioeconomic strata. It's like, well, you know. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see you all here. I particularly want to welcome our speaker, Joy Buchanan. I'll mention at the outset, our talk is sponsored by the Charles Koch Foundation, who's generously funded it, co-sponsored by Delta Mu Delta Honor Society, IU East Center for Economic Education, and the IU East Business and Economic Research Center, Berk. Professor Joy Buchanan is an assistant professor of quantitative analysis and economics at Samford University in Alabama, which I have a personal connection to because I've sent several students to their law school. She received her PhD from George Mason University, like Professor Bose. And, you know, I just wish I had gone there for grad school. Her undergraduate is from Chapman University in California, where she studied under Nobel Prize winner Vernon Carey Smith. She has published articles in peer-reviewed journals, including Labor Economics and Experimental Economics, and also the Journal of Behavioral Economics and Organization, right? Which is even more awesome. Her research is in behavioral economics with a current focus on applying experimental methods to current issues in the labor market. So without further ado, here is Joy Buchanan. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. My name is Joy Buchanan. As you said, I'm from Samford University, and today I'm going to talk about tech jobs. So I want to start with a question for you all. What do you think of when you hear the word SMET? Any thoughts? SMET. That sounds kind of nasty, doesn't it? No one really wants to be associated with SMET, I can tell. Now, raise your hand if you've heard about STEM education. Okay, everyone's heard of it. Everyone knows what it is. You probably think of this as a positive thing. The funny thing is they're the same thing. So STEM, same acronym, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and they just rearranged the letters. So as strange as this sounds, SMET was actually regularly in use by the National Science Foundation in the early 2000s until someone noticed that it just sounds like a bad thing, and they rearranged the letters to STEM, and now everybody loves STEM. Yeah, I wrote about this online, and someone challenged me, and they said, no way, the NSF did not use SMET. I take what we're doing here today very seriously. I wouldn't tell you anything that isn't true. So I went and I emailed a woman who was an assistant director at the NSF during the time of the transition. And she told me that they definitely used SMET. She thinks this change has been positive. So it's kind of a funny story, but why does this matter? STEM skills are certainly important to the economy. The US government actually invests a lot of money in STEM education and in trying to promote STEM education to students and young people. So it raises this question of like, does it matter if we just call it by a different name? It's the same thing, you know, it's the same technical material, it's the same job opportunities when you come, you know, out of these training programs, but does the way that we talk about it matter? Are there messages that we can use that get people more excited about STEM or sort of raise their ambitions or aspirations? So I think it's an important question, again, since, you know, the government is invested in this, and the way that we sort of talk about these jobs and these skills might matter or might not. It's something that, you know, is worth understanding. And we don't have a lot of great data on sort of what messages work and what the effects are of using, you know, different names. So that's part of what I'm working on is sort of how we understand this and how we understand the way that people are making these decisions. So have any of you guys seen the TV show Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe? Yeah, it's a great show. It's about all these sort of like weird jobs, like they're important. Like we really need someone to go down into the sewer and be a sewer inspector, but there's always something really kind of like gross about the job or something sort of uncomfortable about it. And so I've been, writing about this for a while, and I've sort of played with this idea of like, is computer programming a kind of dirty job because it pays well, but so few people want to do it? So I'm trying to understand sort of what the drawbacks are. It's not a dirty job in the sense that you have to like work outside in bad weather or, deal with dangerous animals or something like that. But, obviously there are drawbacks and there are reasons why people don't, go into this field. So that's kind of what I'm studying. I found this report. It was actually published all the way back in 1958 by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it was printed for, young people, college students, people trying to map out their career plan. And they talked about what opportunities they predict going forward for computer programmers. And this is back when computers, looked something like this. So one thing they definitely got right is they predict that over the long run, there would be continued expansion in employment of programmers, and that was definitely correct. They kind of, foresaw how this technology would interact with the needs of offices and businesses. But then what I thought was really interesting is they explained that it's probably a growing field, it probably pays well, and then they said programmers usually work in well-lighted, air-conditioned offices. At the time, that was pretty fancy. We are so wealthy today. Air conditioning is just very widespread in the US today. It wasn't necessarily in 1958, but this was an example of one of the perks that you would get if you sort of attain one of these sort of in-demand skills at the time. And so I don't know if you guys have like heard about what goes on at like big tech, offices in Silicon Valley, and they're sort of famous for their free, sodas and their nap pods and their ball pits, and they're just trying to make it's like everyone has air conditioning now, so they have to go over and above to make sure that they're like giving people perks, and they want their employees to stay, they want them to be productive, and they're just trying to make the environment like as great as possible. So like in that sense, it's definitely not a dirty job. And this is true. There are slides in Google offices because they're just trying to make it like the most enjoyable environment that you could possibly think of. And no, it's very difficult to get hired by Google, so I don't want to misrepresent this. It's not like everyone who majors in computer science will immediately get a job with Google, but as a field, there tend to be good opportunities. So like for instance, the median income. So median is sort of like the typical person in jobs that are classified as computer occupations by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is almost 6 figures, and that's considerably more than the median salary for most fields in the United States. So maybe people don't care that much about having a slide in their office, and maybe most tech workers will never get a slide in their office, but that alone is fairly attractive, and you'd think that would motivate more people to go into this field. And so I'm trying to understand sort of on the margin the decision to pursue an opportunity like this or not. So again, what do we know about Americans who are making decisions to train for sort of new tech jobs, relatively new, and how do they sort of make that decision? Because it's something that you have to train for it before you can do it. So it's sort of this dynamic decision. And so something you might hear from companies who are trying to hire is that there's a skills gap. And actually the skills gap has been, people have been talking about it ever since sort of the Cold War, is that, that we sort of have these needs and we want to be an innovative society, and, high-tech companies want to have sort of a broad base of people they can hire from. And so as an economist, I'm sort of trying to understand what the incentives are and what sort of policy, could be effective if various types of messaging works, or if confidence is an issue, that kind of thing. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about an experiment that I ran And what I was trying to do is create some data and answer some of the empirical questions that I felt like I had identified in the policy literature. I'll talk about some of the potential drawbacks to tech. I mean, of course, there are pros and cons to everything. And there are reasons people don't want to become, not everybody wants to become a software engineer. And of course, that's sort of understandable in a way. And then lastly, I'll talk about whether you should learn to code, which could be, interesting to some people in the audience. All right, so here's my project. It's called Willingness to be Paid, Who Trains for Tech Jobs? And my motivation for doing this is what I just described to you. It seems like there are good opportunities in tech. Salaries are high for people who are able to get these jobs. And so, how do we understand on the margin whether people decide to sort of go for it or choose something else? So some of the issues that are discussed in the policy literature are access to training. Like sometimes there's this sort of underlying assumption that everybody does want these jobs, but they're not confident that they can do it, or they don't have access to the classes that they would need to take. And that assumption, may or may not be right, but maybe access to training is part of it. I mean, for instance, some public high schools have AP computer science and some don't. So there is sort of a disparity in just the opportunities people have to train. Some people may not feel confident that they can do it, and this may affect women disproportionately. So these are issues that are sort of talked about, and I think that it's worth understanding them better and trying to sort of identify like testable hypotheses and get more data that can help us to answer these questions. So this video was made about 10 years ago. If you're curious, you can find it on YouTube. It's called President Obama Asks America to Learn Computer Science. And so he says, don't just, play video games, like make them, you can do it. It's important for our country's future. I mean, you don't see presidents of countries asking people to become lawyers. It's really just this one thing. It's computer science that is sort of important for our economy. It's a national security issue. And so I do feel like it's worth understanding, again, sort of on the margin, what makes people decide to go for this or not. So here are some more facts. This is looking at Google again, and not all tech jobs are Google, but it is a fairly big company. And you can see that within non-technical positions in Google, there's almost a balanced sort of gender distribution. And then if you go over to the actual technical roles, I would assume that includes software engineers. There's a pretty big gap. There are fewer women and more men in those positions. And so, one idea, if you're trying to increase the labor supply in this area, is that if you can attract and retain more women, then, maybe that's just sort of more people that you can draw from who can do this. So of course, if you're doing an economics research project, you look to the literature and you look to see what other people have done in this area. There aren't a lot of projects directly on this question. The closest thing by far that I found when I started the project was a study that was actually done by Google. So they have the financial incentive to understand this question. They want to expand the pipeline of people who can do these jobs. And so they surveyed over 1,000 people and just asked them a lot of questions and tried to understand, what sort of formative experiences seem to sort of direct some people into computer science as opposed to not. So some of the people that they surveyed were women who had chosen to major in computer science. And so they found that people who had gone into computer science were more likely to have been encouraged. They would report that someone, like a parent or a teacher, had encouraged them. So they don't have something that we call random assignment. So they can't say that, exactly the same sort of two groups, one was like treated with encouragement and one was not, but they can sort of find this statistical pattern that people who had gone into computer science were more likely to have been encouraged. So maybe encouragement matters. Personally, I believe that encouragement matters, but I think we don't understand very well when it matters and sort of in what contexts it matters. So maybe, a parent or a teacher who knows you well can really impact your life by encouraging you to do something. But I think it's sort of more questionable whether a poster on the wall or a YouTube video has any like real effect on people. And another thing they found is something that I call subjective attitudes, just sort of what you enjoy doing, again, seem to have sort of a pattern. For instance, the vast majority of women in computer science would agree with the statement, I love math. And not everybody loves math, and not everyone in the survey would agree with that. And so they found that, again, as sort of a difference between the people who had pursued computer science and the people who had not. So I used their survey, and I used their results to sort of guide the design for my experiment and to see if I could sort of replicate some of what they found in a more controlled environment. So here's what I did. First, I brought a lot of people in, and I just asked them to take a survey. And they would earn a little bit of money just to finish the survey. And this only took about 15 minutes total. So by the end, I had over 600 people who had taken this survey, but this version of the experiment is more like 300 people. So in the survey, I asked them if they will come back again and invest more time, but potentially earn more money. So they get paid to finish the survey, and then if they want to, they can just move on and like never talk to me again. That's fine. But I asked them, would you come back and would you train for an hour and learn computer programming, take a quiz, and then the quiz, you know, if presumably you learn all the stuff you need in the training to pass the quiz. And then if you pass the quiz, you can come back for a second hour and do a computer programming task. And you could earn up to $85 for that. So assuming they believe they can pass the quiz, they're kind of looking at like 2 hours, $90. That's decent money. I mean, at an hourly rate, that's probably more than they could make at an on or off campus job. So I thought that would be attractive, or they can just not. So here's how it's actually structured. I'm trying to kind of get at their, what economists call their reservation wage. What's sort of the lowest wage they would accept to take the job. So this is how I asked it. I said, in these increments of $10, would you like an invitation to come back if you would get $15 or $25 or $45 or $85? So would you do it for this entire range, which implies that their reservation wage is pretty low if they would take the 15. And then there were these increments all the way down to only 85. Like I wouldn't do it for 15, I wouldn't do it for 65, but if I get the 85, then I want to come back. And then lastly, they could just say, no, thank you. You know, I'll finish the survey, and even at the highest wage level, I don't want to be bothered. I don't have time, etc. So that was the main question that I asked them. In addition to, you know, a bunch of stuff like, have you taken classes? Have you been encouraged? Did your high school offer AP computer science? Pretty much everything I had found in the policy letter, I tried to sort of stuff into this survey. And then another thing that I asked them that would actually affect how much money they made in the study potentially is I said the quiz after that training is 10 questions. And I asked them to predict how many questions exactly they thought they would get right. And then there's just this little incentive. They get an extra $1 if they just happen to be correct. So I'm trying to get them to tell me the truth about what they really believe, like not just what they think I want to hear. So someone who's very confident might say they believe they're going to get 10 out of 10. Someone who's less confident might say they believe they'll get 8 out of 10. So they think they'll pass, but they don't think that they think they'll miss one, something like that. So this is just a possible measure of self-confidence, since self-confidence seems to be, people at least speculate that that's a big component into the decision to pursue some of these jobs. And so everyone's doing the same thing. Everyone's in the same sort of simple environment. And this would be a chance to observe whether you know, men and women behave differently in such a simple environment. It's simple on purpose. So there are aspects of full-time tech jobs that are not captured here. But if you know, for example, young women are just fundamentally like less confident that they can code, then you would think that that would show up in the form of like a higher reservation wage or a, you know, lower quiz score prediction or something like that. So it's an environment where you could test that kind of hypothesis. And so something you can do in an experiment is you can randomly assign different messages to different people. So with the idea that maybe encouraging messages work, I gave about 1/3 of the student subjects this short little encouraging message, and they could read that before they made their decision about whether to come back for the job or not. And so, the idea was that maybe encouragement affects people. And then for 1/3 of the subjects, I gave them a little bit of extra information. So the task was just described as computer programming, and people could bring whatever beliefs they have sort of to that. But in the info treatment, I showed them a quiz question and I sort of showed them how to answer it. And the idea, again, is that maybe people are not confident, but maybe if they sort of got access to a little bit of training, or maybe once they've taken a class, they kind of understand that it's just kind of a step-by-step thing, and maybe that would affect their decision. So those were the two things that I tested. Now, the first encouraging message was a little shorter. This is the long version of the encouraging message that I used at a different university. So if you want to know what do I mean by this, it has to be kind of short. It has to be something I can just write out to everybody. If you've never done computer programming before, don't worry. Other students with no experience have been able to complete the training and pass the quiz, which was true by the time I was doing this at a second university, because I could point to the first round. I don't know if you believe that would make people more confident or less confident, but I think it's the best I could sort of come up with. And if we are going to do this sort of at scale as a public policy, I feel like that's the kind of thing you'd be doing, is you just be giving out a short message, everyone would receive the same message, and you can speculate as to whether that helps or not. So initially, I did this just as I showed you, with the $15 to $85. And then I did another version of it at another university, and I actually made it a 3-hour time commitment, but potentially up to $145. So I was trying to sort of make this more extreme and get sort of a better read on reservation wages. And then I also, at the end, recruited some people online, because I wanted to have some observations that were not undergraduate students. And so that adds up to over 600 people total. So first, I'll just show you some results from that first university with the 300 students. So I think I have a thing here. So this is the reservation wage in the baseline, which was no extra information, encouraging message, and with that extra information about what the quiz would be like. And these might look different to you, but they're not different statistically. They're basically all the same. So those treatment manipulations didn't really have any effect. Most students were willing to come back. So this is sort of a fairly low reservation wage in the range that I offered. And none of that stuff seemed to matter. The encouraging message didn't seem to make people more confident. The extra information didn't seem to matter. So that's what I found in terms of treatment effects. And then the second university I went to, with the longer encouraging message, it actually made things worse. So people who had seen the long encouraging message have a higher reservation wage. That means they're less willing to do it. And I want to be careful interpreting these results. I think the most I can say is that the encouraging message did not work in the direction that I had predicted. And then if you want to try to take more away, I think it's kind of a warning that messaging can backfire. If you're telling people like, oh, please do this, or even if you tell someone it's easy, they might think, well, why are you saying that? Maybe that means it's hard. So you really want to be careful with these messages, and maybe saying nothing at all is better than kind of a bad message that is bothers people or makes them think that something's wrong. Just little thing to watch out for. So we can compare students that I identified as female or male in the survey. In terms of questions that had some kind of incentive, like somehow what they earned in the experiment was tied to their answers, I really found no gender effect. So this is the initial experiment again, the first 300. Most people predicted that they would pass, but most people did not think they would get all 10 right. The reservation wage between the two groups is about the same. So I was kind of surprised that I didn't see sort of a gender gap at that first place. And these were in the incentivized decisions for sort of a short-term controlled environment. Again, I haven't captured all the aspects of a real tech job. There was no sort of teamwork. There wasn't much of a competition element. It's just that you just show up and just perform this one thing by yourself. And female students seemed willing to do that. Something I can do with that second experiment with a little wider range of reservation wages is I can try to construct a labor supply curve. So the higher the wages, the more people would be willing to enter, the market, and I can put the male labor supply and female labor supply on top of each other, and they seem very similar, like strikingly similar. So again, we're not finding that for the paid work that the female students are less willing to do it, or much less confident. I thought that was interesting. However, remember, I asked them a lot of questions. One thing I asked them is I asked them if they had taken classes before. And some of them said they had taken classes of programming, and some of them had not. And that didn't seem to matter at all. That didn't seem to affect their decisions. So, the whole access to training thing was not doing what I thought it would. Here's a gender gap I found. So the actual phrasing in the survey was discrimination or harassment, but I'm just calling it harassment here. It said, would you expect to experience discrimination or harassment if you actually went to work in tech? And women were much more likely to say yes to that than men. So I think that's interesting. Obviously, there's no sort of harassment or discrimination element in the experiment, but maybe if they're thinking about actual careers and actual companies to work for, this is something to keep in mind, something to take seriously. I asked them, these are just sort of self-reported answers. These are not tied to their earnings in the experiment. I asked them if they believe they could have a career in tech, and I asked them if they're not confident that they could pass the quiz. So just asking, just self-reported answers. And I found, statistically significant differences for both of those. Women were less likely to say that they believe they could have a career in tech, and they're more likely to say that they're not confident to pass the quiz. I think that's worth exploring, and that could, again, maybe help us understand why, 10 years down the line, we do see a gender gap in tech in reality, even maybe if, the groups were equally likely to just sort of show up and do a technical task in the short term. So I showed you some things that sort of didn't matter, and I showed you some things that I didn't find a difference in, but there is one survey question that did predict reservation wage. People who do not enjoy programming have a higher reservation wage. And this was true for men and women. If I asked them, among other things, I said, do you think you enjoy computer programming? Some people said yes, some people said no. And if they said no, then they would require more money to do it. So it almost seems like too obvious in retrospect, but the classes didn't matter, and like the gender didn't matter, and all the things didn't matter except like this. So here's how I actually phrased it, because I know some people have had more experience than others. I said, do you expect to enjoy it and you've had experience doing it? Or do you expect to enjoy it even though you haven't had much experience doing it? And that's how they saw the question, but I kind of collapse it down just to enjoy, not enjoy for my analysis. And so this is for the first group, the first university, and for the people who enjoy it with experience, or for the people who enjoy it with no experience, most of them would just say, I want the invitation, like any wage, low wage, whatever, I want to come back. And then for the people who don't enjoy it, they are less likely to say they'll do it for the lowest wage. They're more likely to say, well, I want to hold out for one of the higher wages. And then another thing I was able to do, since it's a lab experiment, it's hard to do this in the outside world, is I asked them if they would come back and spend the same amount of time, exactly the same amount of time, doing just sort of a tedious counting task. So I wanted a measure for their individual opportunity cost of time. Because someone who doesn't want to come back to program might just have much better things to do. and you know, I wanted to sort of have that as a control to understand their decision. And so one thing I can say is that people who do not enjoy programming, they have to be paid more to program than to do the control task. So it's not just, you might worry that the people who enjoy or don't enjoy have a different opportunity cost of time, and so they're not comparable in that way, but that's something that I can measure and control for. So in terms of, you know, discussion of these results, we know that women are less likely to train for computer science. And we also know that even conditional on getting a job in the field, they're more likely to leave. So I think it's really important to understand why that is. And so this was just a start, sort of preliminary work toward understanding that. I think that this suggests that maybe it's not so much the work itself, or it's not only the work itself, like the technical work. There are other aspects to the field that make it harder for women to get in and to stay, and that's worth understanding more. And sort of famously, some of the earliest programmers for like military funded projects were women. And so, you know, it's certainly not true that women can't program. I mean, we know that, but there are other reasons that may sort of combine together to you know, make up the gender gap in tech. As we said, you know, these young women potentially expected that they might experience discrimination and harassment in the actual field. And so I think it'd be interesting in terms of future avenues for experiments is to think about design changes that might generate a gender gap where I didn't find one, to understand this better. So let's go back to the people and sort of how they made their decisions. I'm not looking at reservation wage right now. Anyone who said they would come back at all is over here. And the minority of people who said they wouldn't come back for any wage are over there on the right. So the blue bar is sort of gender, and you can see that those are about the same between the two groups, which is what I said before. Didn't really find much of a gender gap. And then the green bar is the people who did not want to come back at any wage for the counting task. And so if they're willing to come back and program, they're also usually willing to come back and do that sort of tedious task. So maybe they have a lower opportunity cost of time. And if they weren't willing to come back and program, a lot of them were also not willing to come back and do that counting task. So maybe they have a higher opportunity cost of time. And so maybe to some extent, we can explain the decision simply through the opportunity cost of time, which is not necessarily the training story or the confidence story. And I think that that does have parallels to careers, because people who could go into tech could go into, you know, management and medicine, and there are all these opportunities, you know, open to Americans. And I think that's definitely part of the story if you're trying to understand how people make these decisions. And then the orange bar there, that's enjoyment. You can see that there's a difference here, right? So the people who would come back and program were less likely to say that they don't enjoy it, which I think, again, is a significant part of the story. And so those are some of the conclusions. And again, remember, with your encouraging messages, you might actually do damage if you don't sort of phrase them right. So maybe it's at least worth sort of testing our messaging before we use it. It does seem like STEM is better than SMET. I feel like that's obvious, but in terms of, you know, other messaging that we might use, it may be worth, you know, doing testing to make sure that you don't have one that actually turns people off the way mine apparently do. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about are some of the drawbacks in tech that we've heard from actual people in the field. And then lastly, I'll talk about whether you should learn to code. So if you can get the jobs, which, you know, sometimes they're hard to get. If you can get them, they tend to pay well. But that's not the full story. You know, there are, of course, drawbacks to everything. So if you survey tech workers, either current tech workers or people who have left the field, they will report high rates of burnout. They're just, you know, tired, you know, mental overload. maybe the highest paying jobs have long hours and just very demanding environments, stress from sort of constant problems that come up. And a lot of people report that they're dissatisfied with the way that they are managed. There's a sort of consistent story that HR departments don't understand tech workers very well. They don't know how to recruit people who have sort of up-to-date skills because so few people understand these skills. Why would an HR person sort of know which programming language is appropriate for what tasks? And that can cause difficulties. And of course, it's hard to recruit great managers because ideally they would have all the technical skills and all the people skills and all the communication skills, and that's hard to find. So this is since these technologies are new, I think this is part of the issue and part of what makes it difficult to sort of ramp up these teams quickly for low cost. Another issue, again, since this technology changes so quickly, even if you do learn sort of the hot programming language of the year, you might find that 5 years later, that skill has become obsolete. So really, to have to constantly learn it's just hard. You sort of have to learn. It's not enough to just learn, one thing in 1 year. And then kind of like any, private sector, job, the layoffs is something that can stress people out. I don't know if this is sort of headline news to you guys, but here's an example. Mark Zuckerberg sent this announcement out just back in November that they're going to lay off 11,000 Meta workers. And it's not just Facebook. Pretty much any big tech company you can think of has announced some massive layoff. Twitter, Amazon, fairly recently. And so for the people losing their jobs, like this is really stressful and that's hard on families. This really was like headline news at one point. There was sort of this wave of tech layoffs in 2022. And I kind of want to put that in perspective. During the pandemic, pretty much any tech company you can think of hired a lot of people. And the consensus is that they really overhired. They grew these teams too fast. And now that the pandemic is over, they're getting rid of some of the people who maybe weren't as productive or they just don't need anymore. And I don't think so much this year, but last year there was this whole genre of TikTok videos that were like tech workers who would not have to come in early and get free coffee and would sort of advertise their glamorous lifestyle and, product managers who work from the pool. And so there's some speculation that some of the people, not everyone, but some of the people at these tech companies maybe weren't super productive and weren't needed. I mean, just because you make funny videos doesn't mean you don't work hard, but the aesthetics were kind of off. But again, to keep this all in perspective, big tech is still bigger than it was a decade ago. I mean, they're still expanding. Sort of, if you look at it in the median run, there was actually a whole blog about this by Matt Iglesias about how there was sort of overhiring during the pandemic, but a lot of companies, they're still bigger today than they were before the pandemic. And big tech is not everything. Lots of people need IT workers that are not sort of these big name companies. They may not pay as well, but maybe they're more stable. I mean, the government, the military, like every organization needs people who can, do IT work, who know how code works. So there are a lot of opportunities outside the companies with the NAT pods. And another econ blogger, Joey Politano, he put up this graph when sort of all the headlines were going around about the Twitter layoffs, is that if you look at just sort of the jobs like software publishers, they're going up. Like it's still a growing field. Or if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their sort of medium-term projection is that employment in computer and IT is projected to grow by 15% over sort of the next decade, which I don't know, how accurate that's going to turn out to be, but even as much as these tech layoffs hurt the people who were laid off and it's sort of disruptive to the team in the short term, that's probably not the median term sort of story here. It's still a growing field. These are still sort of in-demand skills. So, should you learn to code? Some of you might think that you're not a math person. And maybe you enjoyed reading as a kid and you don't think of yourself as a math person. And so you think that you won't learn to code or you can't learn to code. So do you think math skills or verbal skills are more important for learning to code? Math. So I heard someone say math. I think that's the typical perception. There's actually a paper on this. There's a study on math aptitude and verbal aptitude. And they looked at people learning Python, and they looked at how fast they were able to learn Python. Python is a coding language. And they found that language aptitude was more important than math skills in terms of being able to learn Python quickly, which was interesting and maybe a little counterintuitive. I think that verbal skills are important and will really just become more important. I've actually taught hundreds of people to code. That's something that I do, and it can be really fun. It can be really fun if someone really didn't know anything in this area, and then they learn their first coding language and they discover that they can make things happen, and then they can sort of build their own digital tools if they want to for the rest of their life. But I remember one young man, he was sort of the beginning of the course, and I had given out this printed sheet of instructions, and they were supposed to enter some commands and kind of get off and running on the first day. And he called me over. He was sort of frustrated, and he didn't know what to do. And so I directed him to the page of instructions I had handed out. And he looked at me, he said, "I can't read this. It's one page of sort of steps to follow." And I think he probably did struggle with reading, and it just kind of highlighted to me the importance of sort of verbal skills and just sort of reasoning. It's not just math, right? It's not just sort of arithmetic. So I like to tell people that there are games that you can play with your kids that are sort of like, it's like fake programming. It's like you basically build a set of instructions, and people call that coding. And parents will buy anything if it claims it will teach your like 7-year-old to code. And I like to say, just read stories with your kids, develop those language skills, develop those reasoning skills. That's probably more important in the long run, because really they need to learn to code, and reading ability and language skills is a big part of that. I spent a lot of time as a kid, alone in the corner reading British novels, which is sort of why I'm a little odd. But counterintuitively, I think that actually helped me learn to code, because I think that, all that reading and just, the ability to sort of follow someone else's verbal instructions can be helpful. So, all right. I haven't really answered the question. Should you learn to code? Not everybody should code. Not everybody should code. We live in a sort of big, diverse economy. The engine of wealth is specialization and exchange. So what you should do is you should get good at something. And we all get good at sort of a different thing. And we're very productive doing this one thing. And then we create a lot of stuff. And then we exchange it with each other. And that's how we have so much. That's why almost everyone in America has air conditioning today, and we didn't 50 years ago. So we have this phenomenon called the division of labor. I don't know if any of you are in an econ class right now. You may have heard of this. So you don't want to do what everyone else is doing. Not everyone should code. Not everyone wants to code. Not everyone has to code, fortunately. But I think it's still true, even though we have all these sort of icons like Steve Jobs, and maybe the perception has improved over the past years about sort of what it's like to work in tech. I still think it's true that not everyone is doing it. And on the margin, a few more people could probably get into this field at this point. It is still projected to grow. All right. I'm going to show you a tweet. Sometimes I'm just going to drop tweets into my slides because this stuff is so new. There hasn't been time to write books about it, okay? So, recent tweet. The hottest new programming language is English. English. I said read books. So, what does this mean? What does this have to do with a very new technology? Maybe college students don't want to admit that they know what ChatGPT is. Maybe that's the issue. Are you guys aware that new tools have come online that will write things for you? Maybe. Again, maybe. oh, I won't tell your teachers that you know. So it won't just write essays for you. It will code. So again, I'm just dropping in these tweets. It's too new. No one's written books about it. The thing about GPT-4 that most feels like a superpower is that I can work with it to write programs to automate annoying tasks. I have created Python programs in the last week. I don't know these languages. So you can just ask GPT to code something for you. And it's not perfect. So I don't want to, overstate it right now. But it will produce something that like either works or might work with a little bit of modification. So this is changing coding dramatically. I have a friend, this is like my best friend from childhood. She actually decided to go to a coding boot camp in like her early 30s and just totally, transition to tech, and she did it. And so I asked her just recently, I said, are you all just using GPT now, or do you still code? I kind of asked her, like, should people still learn to code? And she said, yes, people should still learn to code. My coworker's experience is that ChatGPT can be a nice resource to help you, but sometimes it says stuff that's wrong. So it's like a super powerful tool, especially if you kind of already know what you're looking for, and you can just make those corrections. So that's really exciting. I mean, this is sort of an example of machines coming in, making us more productive. Like the story of our economy over the past 100, 200 years is that the unsafe, unpleasant jobs have been getting better because we have like machines that can do more of it for us. So like if you ever see something that was handcrafted in small batches, you should think, well, my economics professor would probably prefer it be made it by machines in large batches. Like that's how we get efficiency, and that's how we have more stuff to go around. So I kind of feel like ChatGPT is like that for coding. Maybe sort of the worst part is over. The most tedious stuff is going to be done by AI now. It still takes a human to sort of figure out what's usable, fix those errors, but maybe it's actually a really exciting time to learn to code. I asked GPT-4 using Bing this question. I said, "Is prompt engineering a job?" And it developed this little answer for me. Does anyone know what prompt engineering is? That's when you sort of ask the AI to do something for you, but the way that you phrase it is going to determine whether you get sort of a good result or not. So, if you're thinking about it, maybe this is actually the best time to learn to code, because maybe some of the most tedious, boring stuff is getting automated, and it leaves you with sort of better products, and you can be more efficient. But I would still say it really helps to have strong verbal skills. It helps to know a little bit about code going in, so that you sort of know what to do with the output, and you know sort of how to ask for what you want. So if you think back to the experiment that I ran, one reason people don't want to program for me is they just have a high opportunity cost. Good for them. And so AI helpers will sort of make it faster to code and lower that opportunity cost of making digital tools. And maybe it just makes it more enjoyable. Some of the more tedious stuff that you would have had to look up or repeat before can be done for you. And remember, in the experiment, some people don't enjoy it, right? And so if it makes it more enjoyable and faster, then maybe we get more people who can produce this stuff. Okay. Thanks for listening. If you're on Twitter, you can find me at AboutJoy, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I don't know if I can answer them, but I'd be happy to take them.
If anyone has a question, I'll bring the mic to you so you can be heard. Did you have a question?
Thank you. He had an affirmation.
Maybe I'll get us started.
Okay.
I've observed with computer science and computer information systems graduates, one thing about the discipline is it's very much use or lose. If you don't work in that field, you don't have the opportunity to practice what you've been taught in school, and you don't remain current in new generations of softwares, computer programs, or applications. Is that going to change in any sense?
I think that will probably always be more of an issue for software engineers than it would be for doctors. But I think that some of these new tools that are basically dealing in information and basically looking things up for you might make it easier to stay current than it used to be. I can only see that helping, but I do think that, I listed it as a drawback, and I think that will for a while be one of the drawbacks to tech, is that, if it is changing quickly, then that makes it hard to even if you were an expert last year, makes it hard to feel like an expert this year. I do think, though, like, if you've learned one programming language, it's much easier to learn the next one, or it's much easier to learn sort of the new version than if you're just starting from scratch. Yes.
Okay. If I were convinced by your presentation to learn how to code, where would you suggest I start?
That's a great question. There are lots of free resources, and there are lots of websites that will sort of get you started with a language like Python. The friend that I showed her text, she did a coding boot camp, but you don't really do a coding boot camp from nothing. You teach yourself a little bit, and usually you have to pass some kind of assessment just to get into it. I would assume you have great classes here at Indiana University that I would recommend taking advantage of. I mean, maybe that's the first answer. But aside from that, there are lots of resources. One thing I would maybe warn you against is, it's hard to learn it just by reading about it. Like, you really have to do it. So you want to make sure that if you are doing sort of a self-taught method, that you don't just read about it. You want to actually practice doing it. Honestly, build something, build your own website, build your own app. And that's by far the best way to get started. But taking a class right here, or even sometimes, like, I teach in a business school. I teach a data analytics course in a business school, and my students code to do analytics. And so that's another example of sort of a way to get your hands dirty and get started.
Thank you.
How do you think about the artificial intelligence will impact the high-tech job market in the future?
So maybe you're wondering that it will sort of take jobs from software engineers. Is that what you're thinking? I don't see that happening quickly. I think it will make people more productive, and I think that maybe people who have had less training will be able to produce more stuff. But it's still, like my friend said, it still takes a person to sort of guide the process. And the more you know, the better you're able to sort of guide that process. And real software engineering is more than coding, right? You've got to think about structures and systems, and you've got to be able to articulate a problem well. And it's not like ChatGPT can take over all those roles today. So I think it's sort of a machine that will raise our productivity ultimately. It will cause some disruption for sure, like any new technology does. But I don't see it as like overall reversing that medium-term projection by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that this is a growing field for now. In the United States, at least.
Are there certain languages that are better for certain kinds of jobs? Like, if somebody said, I really want to get into gaming, is there a language that's better to learn for gaming? If you wanted to do business analytics, is there a better language for, if these students wanted to begin would they kind of start off learning a language and then find an industry to get into? Or would they think, I'm really interested in getting into this industry and find a language to go the other way?
Yes, some languages are better for some purposes. I do think once you've learned one, it makes it much easier to pick up the next one if you decide that there's a particular sort of type of web application you want to build, and that requires, reading some new documentation. Once you've sort of gone through that process with one language, I think doing it the second time is a lot easier. In the analytics class I teach at our business school, we use R, because R is really meant for doing statistics. It doesn't really do much else besides that. Python is a very, very general language, and the syntax is pretty simple. A lot of people start there because it's fairly, easy to learn, and there are a lot of great resources out there for Python that will sort of walk you through those first steps and give you chances to practice and feedback. There's a website called Code Academy where, a lot of the courses to get you started are free. And so yeah, I think it partly depends on what you're trying to build, or if you are like looking at various jobs, look at the job postings, and if their HR department has it together, they ought to list the languages and skills they're looking for.
So with the increase in AI technology and how everything is going lately, we can see that even in Sweden that they're producing a lot of AI technology and even putting it in their roads now, with allowing electric vehicles to be powered and engineered on the road as they're driving to power the battery. How would you say you would stop these technologies from being able to self-code themselves? Is there a sort of like a malfunction or a fail-safe that is implemented into the coding software to prevent this from happening? Because even from the Bing chatbot hours we're seeing now, it's self-coding and learning all these things because it has the power to, through AI technology, has the power to the entire internet. So how would you stop these things from happening?
I think it's a great question. I think AI safety is something we should all be concerned about. I don't think the answer is to sort of shut it all down necessarily, but I do think that it's something that we should all be aware of and we should all be learning about. A technology that can, make a table for you or sort of write a code script for you is not necessarily like self-aware yet. But I think it's a good question, and developing policies and developing, like we do with any technology. Like now that we have new capabilities, we probably do need some new laws and some new rules, and so I think it's a good question, and it's something we should all be looking out for. Hopefully you're all aware of like deep fakes. You can already make a very convincing deep fake video where it might make it look like a real person is saying something that they never said. And that's been true for over a year now. So hopefully people are skeptical. It used to be that if you saw a picture that you thought you knew what happened, or that, now you can make pictures of anything and they look very realistic. So hopefully we can all just get smarter. Again, I think read the British novels, like develop your reasoning skills, talk to other people, and we have to figure out a way to make it work.
I can use my professor voice. I wouldn't worry too much about AI taking away all of your jobs overnight. It's anecdotal evidence. Some computer engineer has to write programming all the time. But what he finds is that in his line of work, that he's writing programming to translate so that proprietary languages can speak to each other. So it's not Python, it's not R, it's not Visual Basic or Fortran, what I learned. Right? These are company-specific languages where they develop it so that they protect their information. So then he works in a company where different components are pulled together but can't talk to each other. His task is to break down the language and understand the proprietary language from one entity, break down the language from another entity, and write a communicator that will talk to the two languages so that sophisticated machinery will be able to, so far, he was aware of chat. That kind of, he's a, yeah, doesn't understand, doesn't know these proprietary languages because they're not out on the internet.
Mhm.
The chat box to go and monitor. So
Yeah.
whole areas.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
What you get out of Chat GPT these days, sometimes it's really wrong. Like sometimes it might sound right, but they just like made stuff up that never happened, cited books that don't exist, and it might write code that doesn't work. And so you still have to be pretty smart to be able to make it do what you really want it to do. And maybe that's going to change. Maybe it's going to improve very quickly. But at the moment, we don't want to overstate the capabilities of it right now. So I'm almost more worried that people will trust the output when they shouldn't, than worried that the output is like so high quality. Just this month, but things are changing very fast.
I think that's all we have time for. I want to encourage people to stick around to socialize. We have some refreshments outside in the hall, and thank you all for coming. And thank you so much, Joy, for your
This was
insights.
fun. Thank you for coming.